A massive thank you to Audible for sponsoring this video. Stick around for a super limited time offer that could save you 66% on the first 3 months of an Audible membership. I've always felt that Evangelion, if not quite at the earth-shattering popularity seen in its home country, was always massively popular in the West, going way beyond the cult followings of what most would deem quote-unquote successful anime outside of Japan. Almost everyone I know had either seen the series or had a pretty good idea of where it went as a show, and with the recent re-release on Netflix and a new rebuild film on the horizon, this popularity is only continuing to grow. Which got me thinking, where are all the Evangelion games? For a series so ubiquitously merchandised, how is it that I've seen so little about any kind of game adaptation of what is one of the most profoundly influential series of all time? My first thought was that, well, it might just be difficult to turn what Eva is into a video game. It's a mech show, sure, but most people I've talked to know it primarily as the show that gets real deep and weird. References to Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard abound as the show takes our anti-heroes at one of the most existentially tumultuous periods of their lives, puberty, and psychologically tears them apart in order to interrogate our relationships with each other, God, the cosmos, the meaning of our achievements, our need to belong versus the need to define one's own identity. And sure, it might seem difficult to transpose that stuff onto a traditional mechanical framework, but think of it this way, Eva is also a Monster of the Week show. The city of Tokyo 3 is an arena with its jutting buildings providing less residential comfort as much as tactical advantage for the combatants fighting it out down there, recalling nothing if not old tokusatsu shows. Dazzling theatrical combats between giant humanoid mechs and hulking beasts are certainly not absent from the series, so where are my cool video game robot fights, damn it? Well, as it turns out, the answer to that question is a lot simpler than I initially imagined. There's plenty of them, a veritable cornucopia of interactive entertainment bearing the show's name. Visual novels, action RPGs, fighters, patchy slot, you name it. Games that apparently provide tangible backstory to the series, the kind of thing die-hard fans would live for. It's just so few of the games were ever released outside of Japan, let alone hitting anywhere close to the West. And this leaves anyone curious about exploring the Eva adaptations with a couple of problems. First and foremost, not knowing Japanese is going to see you relying on intuition to get through most challenges set before you, aside from the odd GameFAQs guide here or rare fan translation there. Second, and this might be a bigger problem for me than anyone else, is just knowing where to start with these games. There's so much to dive into, all of it incredibly varied. And so I thought it would be neat to see for myself what the world of Evangelion games had to offer. And what I took away were some interesting thoughts on what it means to turn an IP from another medium into a video game. Unfortunately, even getting past the accessibility issues of procuring the equipment needed to play, let alone capture footage from these games, given that a lot of them are primarily text-based, this means that no matter how hard I tried, that first problem of my language skills not being up to snuff was inevitably going to rear its head. Games like Secret of Evangelion or Neon Genesis Evangelion 2, for example, games that seek to expand the canon of the show, are titles I wouldn't have much to offer on beyond what some decade-old online guide or forum posts would illustrate. But honestly, digging into the classified files and uncovering some greater truth about Eva's story, or even going into every available Eva game, was never my intention here. I was more interested in focusing on a select few games to see how different titles tackle the challenge of representing this fairly hard to pin down show through mechanics, both its moment-to-moment action as well as, perhaps, its more introspective elements. And after seeing someone alert me to the fact that the 1999 release of Neon Genesis Evangelion for the N64 had its own version of Comes As a Toad using the console's sound font, I knew I'd found my starting point. And being only the second licensed Eva game to be released after a visual novel carrying on the goofier timeline seen in the show's final episode, I can't say I was expecting something so inseparably tied to the show it was drawing from. Put it this way, if you were to take, say, Cowboy Bebop and turn it into a game, you wouldn't expect a level where you have to sit around good while waiting for Asimov before launching into a bespoke hand-to-hand combat sequence that appeared nowhere else in the game. No, you make up a bunch of scenarios where Spike has to pilot his ship on rails because you want to keep things simple, with action mechanics that people can understand. Better a coherent game where you can focus on making the core systems as good as they can be, than a mess of every mechanically disparate moment in the show. Well, here we we have the equivalent of that initial scenario, an astoundingly literal take on Evangelion as a show, where almost every notable action scene has its own mission, and every mission has a unique set of mechanics and controls that almost always amounts to bashing out various blister-inducing combinations of A and C, replete with supposed to lose sections in which Shinji gets the heck beaten out of him and Unit 1 goes berserk, for example. With the game's reliance on QuickTime events to cover the wide range of scenarios found in Evangelion proper, your interactions are less of a priority here than the game guiding you through its whirlwind tour of the show's key action scenes. And while visually it's pretty striking for an N64 game, what it doesn't capture anywhere near as effectively is the feeling of being in an Eva. The Evas, as seen in the show, animate, move, and bend in ways that are unrealistic for robots, sure, but they aren't really robots in the traditional sense. They're humanoid in nature, they sync with their human pilots to move as humans do. They're fast, wiry, their movements as athletic as they are balletic. And here, in the one-on-one fight sequences where you're arguably given the most direct control over your Eva, you're sometimes moving with seconds between each individual step. To say these controls are clunky is an understatement, contradicting even other missions in the game, which see the mechs bouncing and flipping around in the manner you'd expect them to, just not in a way you can control. Likewise, the game's overall pacing is inconsistent to say the least. Certain missions are ruthlessly unforgiving, even on the easy mode you're required to start with, meaning that for multiple levels I'd find myself repeatedly sitting through up to a minute of unskippable cutscenes in order to get another chance at figuring out what was required of me in any specific moment, on a screen where approximately 10% of what is shown is actually useful visual information. On the other hand, some missions can last as little as 30 seconds as you point the cursor at the thing. What it all amounts to is a fairly admirable attempt to stay true to the show and let fans play out its numerous iconic action sequences that ends up spreading itself far too thin mechanically to be any fun as an actual game in its own right, following the letter of the law rather than the spirit. Point thing here, attack there, hope that you don't fall foul of the game's ludicrously wonky hit detection, turning fights into a deeply frustrating guessing game. All of it means that Eva 64 ends up resembling Dragon's Lair more than a traditional action title. You know, press button to make the movie go. And given that you need to slog through this set of missions 3 times to unlock the true ending, which is just a couple of scenarios from End of Evangelion pared down dramatically to what an N64 could handle, the kindest thing I could say is that the couple of hours it'll take you to do so once you're used to the way the game works is at the very least mercifully short. In the end, it's not like I could even recommend this one to anything other than the most insatiably curious of fans. There's nothing new here, it's like watching the barest form of the show, but every so often Netflix stops and demands you hurt your thumbs before carrying on. So not off to the best start here, but the potential of a literal adaptation of the show is certainly interesting. Luckily we have 2009's Evangelion Joe, I guess, on the PSP to attempt to fully realize it. See, if Eva 64 was a tour of the show, then Joe is a literal, if infinitely more involved take on the first Rebuild film, and the events of the show beyond that. It's literal in the sense that you are yet again playing through almost all the key action scenes in the show, with the wild reimagining of angels found in You Are Not Alone, and the comparatively dazzling visuals of the PSP to boot. Play through the first mission with its equally QuickTime driven version of the Sakiel fight, and you'd be forgiven for thinking that Joe is merely Eva 64 with a fresh coat of paint. The first sign that something is different, however, comes as you take control of Shinji himself, exploring each of the show's environments and making conversation with its key characters. And although my lack of Japanese kept me from engaging too heavily in the game's stat-based relationship system, it's certainly neat to explore these places that neither the show nor most other Eva games I played really flesh out as residential spaces. And it all comes down to the fact that, as the lengthy first-person boarding animation preceding each battle would suggest, this is a game as interested in immersing you in the world of Evangelion as it is in guiding you through the show's action. But that's only the entrance to this game's rabbit hole, opening up to something altogether more tactical than anything seen prior. On the surface, missions see you move around a city as you'd expect. Battles are one-on-one as you attack angels with guns and swords, occasionally dodging or blocking using an AT field. The movement is so much more fluid than in the N64 game, with running and rolling capturing the more humanoid movements that were missing from that title. But here things start to go deeper. See, Evangelion Joe is also a tower defense game, with the network of tunnels and containers Misato would use to resupply Eva's mid-battle now falling entirely under your control, as you dot turrets and weapons around the different sectors of Tokyo 3's surprisingly large map. Like exploration makes the environments feel more tangible, the use of the city's architecture in combat gives the game a feeling of authenticity, as you're required to utilize Tokyo 3 as the same kind of arena you see in the show. And this really is a must because enemies are fast and strong enough to wipe your health out incredibly quickly. And this is health, mind you, that doesn't totally refill at the end of a fight. So you need to talk to Ritsuko and select the second option in her dialogue menu to heal your Eva lest you enter the next fight at a fraction of your vitality. It's all incredibly involved, but like Eva 64 before it, the difficulty curve is all over the place, with certain missions requiring little more than a couple of QuickTime events, and others seeing you frantically dipping behind cover as you pile clip after clip into your enemy, only dodging when absolutely necessary to save your slowly filling AT gauge, trying to lure an angel over to a turret without losing a massive chunk of health thanks to the game's, again, inconsistent hit detection, all while contending with ridiculously aggressive time limits. And the problem with this level of challenge is that the win conditions are anything but consistent. Even an absolutely perfect run feels like it'll only sometimes break the enemy's AT field or drain their health. Other times it's almost impossible to tell if you're even making a dent. The only way to know for sure is if a QuickTime prompt appears and you'll perform some flashy finisher. Otherwise, you watch the same excruciatingly protracted game over screen before loading a previous save and hoping you don't have to navigate a whole bunch of menus and previously purchased upgrades to attempt the mission one more time. And given how arbitrary the win conditions seem to be here, this is a routine you should get used to. Coupled with my personal frustration of actually trying to play the game, seeing as its file encryption makes emulation past the first mission practically a no-go, it's another interesting experiment in directly translating the show to video game form that is ultimately too messy and tedious in its execution for me to ever want to actually play. And so with Eva 64 and Joe, even with improvements between the two games, we're 2 for 2 here, no closer to finding a truly definitive or even particularly enjoyable video game. But what about something that goes completely the other way, a game that disregards the need to adhere too closely to the events of the anime and instead forge its own path in representing the show? Well, enter Neon Genesis Evangelion Battle Orchestra, a 2D fighting game produced by Broccoli, released for the PS2 in 2007 and for the PSP in 2009. With the perspective and layout of the stages, the obvious comparison is to Smash Bros., a similarity solidified by the game's roster, something of an all-star lineup consisting of the show's mechs and monsters, complete with story campaigns for every human fighter, with characters like Kensuke and Toji now working as agents of Sailor from what I can gather. This should be great, and as I've come to expect, upon closer inspection, is far from a perfect or even decent fighting game. It features an awkward camera that's constantly zooming in and out to account for characters at the edge of the screen, inconsistent difficulty as certain enemies will wipe half your health in one combo, AI that doesn't know whether to flail around wildly or just stand bolt upright, as well as, again, some super dodgy hit detection when characters are close to each other. But despite all of that, movement here is undoubtedly fast, and it still feels good to control these mechs as the quick-footed humanoid creatures they are. The Evas move like Evas here. The problem is that, well, so do the angels, these often monolithic creatures whose abstract forms see them representing vague religious concepts as much as they resemble traditional monsters, now run, jump and bounce around these stages as if they were Evas themselves. It speaks to the difficulty of balancing characters for a fighting game, where everyone more or less has to be on equal footing, so to speak. And there are some neat aesthetic workarounds to be found in this regard, where an orb like Lilial extrudes previously devoured skyscrapers instead of arms. It's just that these workarounds are outweighed by scenarios that regress into the straight up goofy, with the nondescript octahedron Ramiel somehow managing to pick up a little axe, or the terrifying scale of Sahaquiel being reduced to flapping around like a fish. That is to say, this game is silly, which is fine. It's hilarious to see a skyscraper-sized pen chilling in the background as two Eva units battle it out, and the developer has made interesting use of the show's lore as item pickups, such as the dummy plug allowing an AI to take over and presumably fight in a slightly more efficient manner than a human player. But when you consider that stage hazards can include things as daft as monster sharks that bite your Eva to death, it's clear that the developer's attention to detail in this regard fails to stretch across the entire game. For as big and celebratory a project as the game seems from the outset, with its roster and surprising emphasis on story, the silliness of of its action, combined with a general lack of polish when it comes to things like the viability of certain characters on certain stages, makes the whole experience feel fairly cheap and slapdash. Battle Orchestra is an example of bending and breaking the show to fit a fighting game framework, rather than accurately representing it. It's less an Eva game and more a Smash Brothers clone with an Eva skin on it. If it were tighter as a fighting game, I'd recommend checking it out, but as with everything else we've seen so far, it's the territory of curious fans only. So is that it? After all that exploration, all the hassle of getting things to run properly, is this really all that the world of Evangelion can bring to the world of video games? Surely there has to be something legitimately good in there, right? Well, what if I were to tell you that said game definitely exists, and rather than attempting to literally convey the show, the best Eva game I played turned out to be a rhythm game developed by Grasshopper Manufacture, produced by Suda51 of Killer 7 and No More Heroes fame, and featuring the series music rearranged by Silent Hill composer Akira Yamaoka? Yeah, things are about to take a turn here. But before we get into that, let me take a minute to tell you about something else that's legitimately great. Today's sponsor, Audible, home of the largest selection of audiobooks on the planet. As a regular user of the service for a while now, I'm pretty blown away by the selection. From bestsellers to curios I'd never expect to see in audiobook form, it's all here and super easy to access. Members get a free credit to use on any audiobook, with unused credits rolling over to the next month, and I'm a big fan of how, even if I were to cancel my membership, I still get to keep those audiobooks to re-listen to at any time. That kind of security in my purchases is something I value a great deal. One of the best purchases I've made, and something I can personally recommend, is the autobiography of Scottish comedian / Twitch streamer Limmy. Surprisingly down to earth and very funny. He's known as a comic, but the way he's able to soar so effortlessly between his mental health struggles and, say, his reign as the king of Flash development, all without ever watering down his dialect for the sake of wider appeal, puts him right up there with the great Glaswegian authors like James Kelman or Alistair Gray as far as I'm concerned. And the fact that the audiobook is narrated by the man himself makes this a must-listen in my eyes. And what's more, by clicking the link in the description, Amazon Prime members can save 66% on your first 3 months of Audible membership. Offer is valid until the 31st of July 2019, so you've only got a few days from the publishing of this video. Visit audible.com/writingongames or text writingongames to 500 500 to start your audiobook journey and support the show in the process. Thanks again to Audible for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to the Suda51 produced Evangelion rhythm game, I guess. Named Evangelion New Theatrical Edition Third Impact. Third Impact? Oh, because it's the Japanese number 3, so it's Sound Impact? Yup, this is absolutely a Grasshopper game. Wait a minute, where were we? Oh yeah, Evangelion New Theatrical Edition Sand Impact was released for the PSP in 2011, and honestly flew completely under my radar as a massive fan of the studio's output. Suda has previously talked about Grasshopper's licensed work as a necessity to pay the bills and allow the team to work on their own projects, but after coming back to the game time and time again, it's hard to view this as something churned out to make a quick buck. Even as you load into the main menu and you're greeted with a montage of game footage set to a wonderfully upbeat version of the show's next episode theme, you know this is coming from a place of genuine appreciation for the property the team is working with. And this vibrancy carries into the gameplay, which, combined with the game's striking UI design, makes for an absolute treat for the senses. Missions see each major narrative beat of the Rebuild films confined to a group of 3 levels or so, each with their own mechanics and tracks. Initially, you'll have a kind of call and response with an angel as you analyze its movements before moving into an attack stage, where you'll usually be hitting buttons in sync with gradually filling octahedrons as footage from the films play out behind it all. It perhaps seems like an abstract way of gamifying the property, but consider that those movies, the show as a whole, is also fairly abstract in itself. What Sound Impact does is realise that trying to cram every moment of the show into an action and RPG and visual novel and fighting game framework will only result in a mess of a final product. And so they decide to work within their limits by taking a step back, examining the broad thematic strokes of the show, and see if they can find a design that gracefully encompasses as much of it as they can. When examined in that sense, you could say that Evangelion is a show about harmonization and synchronization, terms literally used by the show on multiple occasions as our pilots attempt to become one with their Evas, or in a broader sense, become one with themselves as they try desperately to figure out who they are and what their place in this world is. What better way to represent that struggle than musically focused mechanics that require literal synchronization with a beat? The music is often energetic enough, the focus required from players intense enough that enemy encounters feel truly frantic. Way more so, that is, than the more traditional action sequences found in prior games that more often than not devolved into quick-time events anyway. And for a series with music so iconic, a good deal of the tracks featured here focus on odd, lurching melodies, the occasional irregular time signature, and sometimes full-blown ambient drone with a discernible downbeat occurring only every 4 bars or so. The challenge of the game in instances like this is internalizing a rhythm where said rhythm might not be readily apparent, where there might be some time between button presses and no real rhythmic indicator as to when the next will appear. The communication of visual information is maybe an issue, with the debris of filling octahedrons making it difficult to concentrate on exactly what's required of, let alone the movie footage. But then again, multiple points in the show feature the characters having to remove themselves from outside distractions in order that they can focus on the mission at hand. For a game so seemingly abstract, no Eva game prior has featured mechanics so thematically cohesive. For as literal as those other games are, they miss out on all these little details that make Evangelion the show it actually is. It all goes to show that when it comes to adaptation, the most literal approach might not always be the most appropriate one. It makes for some interesting curios, and it's neat to see the show's iconic scenes rendered in varying levels of fidelity. However, when it comes to capturing the essence of what Evangelion is, it's obviously far more than big action scenes with robots. A focus on combat requires a set of animations and tightness of control that reflects the oddly humanoid movements of said robots, and we largely have that in Joe and Battle Orchestra. But what I'd be interested in more in the future is the grasshopper approach, tapping into the more conceptual themes of the show by going for a less orthodox mechanical framework. We already have the Dragon's Lair thing down multiple times over. Give me more weird rhythm games. And with the popularity of Evangelion burgeoning outside of Japan, perhaps more than it ever has done, it seems now would be a better time than ever to experiment with the gamification of this beloved franchise on a more global scale. So I hope you enjoyed this piece on Eva Games. Once again, I'd just like to thank this video sponsor Audible and remind you to check the link in the description before the 31st of July 2019 for the great offer I mentioned earlier. I'd also like to thank my wonderful patrons for their continued support. Videos like this take a lot of effort to produce, and I really cannot thank you enough for allowing me to spend the time necessary to make it all happen. In particular, I'd like to thank Mark B. Writing, Rob, Nico Blakely, Sivas, Artyom Vitsyuk, Bryce Snyder, Tommy Carver-Chaplin, David Björk, Lucas, Hibi Amore, Dallas Keane, William Fielder, my dad, Ali Al-Muhanna, Timothy Jones, Spike Jones, The Nameless Guy, Chris Wright, Ham Megas, Zach Casserly, Samuel Pickens, Shardfire, Hannah Pimentel, Jesse Ryan, Brandon Robinson, Justin Solderness, Nicholas Ross, and Charlie Yang. And with that, this has been another episode of Writing on Games. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.